All right, it's Tuesday, it's 2 o'clock, so it must be time for another live stream. Today we're covering a topic that really we haven't spent a lot of time on over the past several months, and it's really overdue, and that is, today we're going to be talking about graphics and the user interface on the Horner OCS, specifically talking about using graphics and animation. And joining me today is Mr. Casey Gardner. How are we doing today, Casey?
Hey, not too bad.
It's going great. You and I both work with a lot of customers, a lot of OEMs. It's amazing to me the difference in attitude towards graphics and the user interface between customers. You have some where, boy, it's critical, and others where it's kind of an afterthought. Big difference, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stark contrast where some of it you have to design aesthetically from the beginning, where there's lots of different layers of different visibility on objects, or sometimes it's just, well, we just want it to functionally work. So just put some buttons on the screen and maybe have some text here and there, but that's about it. So it's a wide variety for
big difference. Well, another thing I like to tell customers, especially new ones, before they get started with their system design is, if they can, they should really try and map out their user interface ahead of time, so they have a really good idea of what they want their operator's experience to be when it comes to graphics and screen movements and all those sorts of things. So that's definitely something that if people spent more time on that up front, then they would spend less time kind of coding it and figuring it out as they go. So that's definitely a hint I'd like to give them if possible. So anyway, as we go through our material today, Casey's going to be manning the chat. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. We're going to get those answered, whether Casey answers them as they happen or whether he saves them until we join back up together again after we cover the material. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Again, today's program is using graphics and animation with the Horner OCS. So what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to start out by talking about the OCS graphics specifications, because it's important before you start the process of bringing graphics into the Horner controller that you have a good understanding of the types of capabilities it has in terms of resolution, etc., etc. So we're going to talk about the different OCS models you could be using and what their graphic specifications are. From there, we're going to talk about importing graphics in. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about trend objects and push button objects and gauge objects and those sort of built-in objects. We're going to focus today on bringing graphics from the outside in to the OCS, whether that's images or drawings or whatever the case may be. And we're going to start out by talking about what's called the static bitmap object. So that's an object you use to bring in just graphics from the outside that are going to be the same regardless of what's going on with the machine. We're also going to talk about something that a lot of customers do take advantage of, but really more should, and that is the symbol library. Cscape, of course, is a free program, but it's also available at a modest cost to be acquired with what's called the symbol library bundled with it. And what that symbol library does is it gives you more tools when it comes to developing graphics on your OCS, and we're going to talk about that in detail. And then finally, we're going to talk not only about static bitmaps, we're also going to talk about animated objects. So not just graphics that are the same regardless of the state of the machine, but also graphics that change up depending on what's happening with the equipment. So that involves the animation object. So we'll be talking about that as well. All right, so let's dive right in. Okay, so as we start to talk about graphics, we really need to talk about specifications. And the specifications that we need to understand before we dive into start importing photos and stuff is we need to know the resolution of the unit we're working with. We really have to have an idea of its aspect ratio. That's a useful type thing to know as we kind of map out what objects should go where on the screen and what shape the photos should be or images should be and those sorts of things. We also need to take a look at color depth. That's something that people often overlook, and that is how many colors, 32,000 colors, 16 colors, 256 colors, how many colors make up the graphics that we're bringing in, and how does that match up with the OCS screen that is displaying them. And then, of course, we need to talk about file format as well, whether we're talking about bitmaps or JPEGs or PNGs or whatever the case may be. Those are the specifications that are important to understand on an OCS standpoint before you start talking about the specifics of the graphics. So we're going to spend just a minute or so talking about our most basic entry-level products that have monochrome screens, because most of the time when people are talking about bringing photos in and images in and spending a lot of time on graphics, they're not usually talking about 2-inch monochrome type screens. But do keep in mind that these products are graphic screens. You can bring monochrome graphics into them from outside your project, but it's obviously something that's not critical for most applications using these products, because if it was critical, they'd probably use a bigger display. So the X2 and the XLE products, they have a 2-inch screen with 128 by 64 pixel resolution. And of course, they're only supporting monochrome graphics, 2-color. And the same or similar is true for the XLT, although it does have a little bit bigger display, 160 by 128. So there are some customers we do have where their primary motivation for the XLT is for an outdoor application, and they do use some graphics beyond just the built-in objects like push buttons and pilot lights with the XLT. But again, we're going to spend most of our time today talking about our other products, which have more of a advanced user interface, or specifically their screens are full color, they're bigger, they have more resolution, and they support 15-bit color, which allows you to have some pretty vivid graphics and bring in some pretty nice detail on any photographs or images that you bring in. One thing I would like you to notice, though, even as you look at this chart here, is that even though all of these are kind of widescreen products, the aspect ratios are not identically the same. So don't assume just because that you're using an X7 and an X4 that their aspect ratios are identical and they'll scale identically the same. They don't necessarily. So it's not a huge deal, but just something to be aware of, that there is some slight differences in aspect ratio between the units. Now, as you move up to the XL series, there the aspect ratios are a little more consistent. There you start out with quarter VGA and full VGA in a 4:3 aspect ratio. And then you've got the 7-inch and the wide 6 that have 800 by 480 resolution. All these units support 15-bit color depth, which is 32,768 colors. And then of course you also have the 15-inch XL Plus, which has the highest resolution as well as the most detailed color. It can support 24-bit color, which is over 16 million colors. Okay, so that should give you a flavor for the specifications. Now, as we talk about file format, regardless of the model, if you're talking Cscape today, you're talking about bitmaps, JPEGs, and scalable vector graphics format, or SVG. Now, when Cscape 10 is released and we have some other new models with some new graphics capabilities, we're going to bring in some new data type or some new file types as well. We'll bring in some GIFs, we'll bring in some PNG types. But for today, and there's a lot of OCS units out there that can display great graphics, but for today we're talking about bitmaps, JPEGs, and SVG. As we talk about developing graphics for Cscape, when you're developing screens, whether it's, again, push buttons and pilot lights or trend objects or bar graphs or gauges, whatever the case may be, when you're developing screens for an OCS, you need to open the Cscape Graphics Editor. And then within the Cscape's Graphics Editor, you have a number of objects all shown at the screen that you can use to kind of build the contents of your various screens that you present to your user. And there are about 30 objects total, including things like switches and indicators, bar graphs, gauges, all kinds of objects. But the one specifically we're going to be talking about today is ones that are affiliated with bringing in graphics from the outside. And we're going to start with the static bitmap object. This is an object that you would use, again, if you want to import your own graphics or artwork into a screen onto the OCS. So the way that this works is you start, of course, by clicking on and selecting the static bitmap object, and then you click and drag an object approximately the size that you want on your screen. It doesn't have to be exactly the size that you need, but just approximately the size you're looking for. And then once you've done that, you double click on the object, and then that pulls up the static bitmap dialog box. Okay, so the first step is you're going to need to select which graphic or which image that you want to bring in. And you have your choice between JPEGs, bitmaps, and SVG, or scalable vector graphic format. And when you click on one of those buttons, you're going to get a dialog box that pops up that allows you to select the file that you want to import. Now, if you're using the version of Cscape that includes the symbol library, then you're also going to have an option to pick your image from the symbol library. But we'll talk about that in more detail later. Now, once you've selected your graphic, there are some important configuration options on the dialog box that if you don't get those right, you're not going to get the results that you want. Let's start with the scale to fit checkbox. So I always recommend that when you're bringing a graphic into Cscape, that you start out with not having the scale to fit check marks checked. If you're talking about bringing in an image, you're always better off scaling for size that image before you bring it into Cscape using some sort of separate graphics editor. You're just going to get better results that way using a dedicated graphics program. It can be a free dedicated graphics program, but it should be probably a separate program. You're just going to get the best results that way. Now, in addition to that scale button, there's also the selection of colors. And this is an area that really trips a lot of people up. You really want to more or less match up the number of colors that you select here to the number of colors included in the image that you're bringing in. And if you're not sure on the image you're bringing in how many colors it has, guess high. So if you're not sure how many colors it is, just guess 32,767. You're unlikely to run out of graphic space in most cases. So again, if you're not sure, just guess high. All right, but ultimately what you want to do is select a number of colors that's appropriate for the display you're using and for the image that you're bringing in. Then there's one last thing when you're bringing in images, and that is transparency. Now today, we don't support yet file formats that have transparency built in, like PNG, for instance. We will be supporting that with Cscape 10, but they're not there yet. However, Cscape actually does a pretty darn good job of implementing transparency on bitmaps or JPEGs that it brings in. And I've had really good luck, especially with bitmaps. So if desired, again, you can check a checkbox that says treat the background as transparent. And then Cscape will estimate based on the graphic what it thinks that the transparent color ultimately will be, or what it's starting out as that it will become transparent. And then depending on how many colors in the graphic that you're keeping are close to the color of the background, you may need to adjust your sensitivity dial there or slider there to get the exact result you're looking for. So that's just something to be aware of, but we'll demonstrate that later on. It's not quite as complicated as it seems. Okay, so what's the summary on how to get great results when you're talking about graphics in Cscape, bringing in images, for instance? 1, use an independent graphics editor. Again, it doesn't have to be an expensive graphics editor, but any graphics editor you use for rescaling an image down to the size that you need it is going to be really good at doing that job. So you definitely should do that for sure. And that program also could help you adjust the number of colors from, say, a 24-bit bitmap down to 16 bits, which is all the OCS can display anyway. And also what it helps with is the OCS then doesn't have to do the translation, the color translation job, okay? And then again, I've had the best luck with ending up with bitmap files that I bring into the OCS, mainly because there's a lot of variability between JPEGs in terms of their level of compression. Bitmaps are a little more certain. They're a little more straightforward. So I've had better luck with bitmaps getting the result I'm looking for when it comes to bringing in images. So that's a hint I would give you as well. But it's one thing to kind of suggest how to do it. Let's just show you how to do it. That's always a good thing. So we're going to start off with, let's go ahead and fire up Cscape here. And I've got a program that I've developed, again, a very simple little demo program here. And let's say that the first thing that I want to do when it comes from a user interface standpoint, from an image standpoint, is I want to import and put on the main screen, I want to put my company logo. That's a really common thing. A lot of times companies want to have their logo on the main screen. So let's go ahead and do that here. Now, I'm working with an EXL6. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I have here. Let's go ahead and show the overhead view. So again, this is my main screen. Obviously not very sexy for sure. Just plain text, Horner Automation. Instead of this, let's get the Horner Automation logo on there, just like a lot of our OEMs would like to do, get their company logos on the screen as well. Okay, so back to our computer. But before we dive into Cscape on this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the graphic file or the logo file that I got from our marketing guru, Marcy Tyree. before she took the day off today and left Casey and I all on our own. So how dare she? Okay, here we go. So this is the bitmap. It's not really bitmap, it's actually a JPEG that she sent me. It looks nice, high resolution. We want to make sure that's going to look great on the front of the unit. Let's take a close look here by right-clicking under Properties. Let's take a look at the resolution of this particular file. So I'm going to go to Details and see that, oh wow, look, it's 2134 by 525 pixels. I've got an EXL6 I'm dealing with. It's 800 by 480, so I'm going to need to scale this down significantly. It's also using 24-bit color, and if I don't have the ability to convert from 24-bit to 16-bit, then Cscape's going to have to do that for me. So let's go ahead and see what we can do with this file before we bring it into Cscape. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and right-click here on the file, and I will say Edit with Paint 3D. Now, Paint 3D is just the free basic editor that's included with Windows 10. And there's also MS Paint, which is kind of the original version. It's also installed with Windows 10 if you want to search for that as well. But I'm going to go ahead and use Paint 3D here just to rescale this image. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to go to the Canvas section here and make sure my aspect ratio is locked and resize image with canvas is checked. And then it's showing here the resolution of this image. I'm going to go ahead and change that. And if I've got 800 pixels wide to work with, let's say, I don't know, we want to make this graphic about 720. Let's go with, say, 720 here. And I'll hit Enter. And you can see it's rescaled the graphic. Okay, so it's done the work and done all the graphics estimations that Cscape now won't have to. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and hopefully it's going to give me the option of saving under 16-bit color instead of 24-bit color, but if not, we'll just live with that. So I'll go to Menu here, I'll hit Save As, I'll save as an image, and then I have my choice of different formats. I've told you a couple times already today, I've had really good luck with bitmap format, so I'm going to use bitmap format, and I'm going to rename it. Instead of Horner logo large, I'm going to give it a name of EXLW because that's the unit I'm putting it into. So I'm going to hit Save. Now, it didn't give me the option from a color depth standpoint of going down to 16-bit color. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but I think Cscape can probably deal with that. Now, normally, because I am a Photoshop user, normally I would use Photoshop. And when I use Photoshop for that, it does give me the option of saving it in 16-bit format. Now that said, Photoshop's a much more expensive program than the free software that's included in Windows 10. So you can see there's a big difference there in cost for sure. Okay, so let's go into Cscape. All right, and again, whenever we're editing graphics, we need to do it from the View and Edit Screen area of Cscape. I'll maximize my screen. And let's just go ahead and get rid of this kind of ugly blank title here. And I'm going to go to the static bitmap object. I'm going to click it. I'm going to click and drag something that's about the size of what I need. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly the size. All right, I double click on it. Now I'm going to uncheck scale to fit. That's really important because that means that the graphic will come in its native resolution. It won't be stretched or distorted at all because I pre-scaled it to the right size. Also, it's really important that I select 32,000 colors, which is as close as I can get to the 24-bit color that image is coming in as. Okay, so those two steps are really important. Now I'm going to hit Pick Bitmap. All right, and now I can look for that file that I just saved, and there it is, Horner logo EXLW. I say open, and then we panic. Oh no, it's all scrunched. Don't worry, that's just a limitation in the preview window in Cscape. It's going to look fine when we actually hit OK here. I do that, and there we go. So it looks like it imported pretty well. All right, that looks good. Now, one thing I noticed is it's not transparent, and let's say I want to make it transparent. So let's go ahead and make that change. So I'm going to double click on it again, and I'm going to click Treat Background as Transparent. Now, Cscape is guessing the transparency color started out as white, and that's true. And I'm very confident this is going to turn out really well because none of the colors that I'm keeping in the graphic are anywhere close to white. We've got variations of blue and gold, so nothing close to white. So I don't need to mess with this sensitivity button at all. If, let's say, the background was blue instead of white, I would either need to change the color of the background before I brought the file in, or play with this sensitivity level to actually get it to an appropriate point where Cscape could figure out what colors were the background. So anyway, but this is easy. I don't need to worry about it. I hit OK, and now we can see that, yep, sure enough, it is transparent. So let's go ahead and download this to the EXLW that I have connected here. So I'll hit download. All right, we'll start that process. We'll go to our overhead camera here. All right, you can see the download is in progress. And we'll see how that ended up once we finish. And it does take a little longer to download bitmaps and JPEGs than, of course, regular graphic objects, but that didn't take too long. And as you can see, that's a pretty good result. So that's what I'm looking for. So I've got good detail in the logo. It's not distorted. It's not the wrong colors. It's not, jagged edged because there's not enough resolution. So that's a pretty good result. So again, that's a good workflow for bringing in something like a company logo into an OCS through the static bitmap object. Okay, now let's head back to our program and let's move on to the next topic, and that is the Cscape Symbol Library. So what is the Cscape Symbol Library? Well, that's effectively an optional package that is developed by a third party, a company that has, employed artists to draw over 4,000 professionally drawn objects that are of an industrial theme. And all those objects, if it's integrated into Cscape, are available to use in your project. Okay, they're not images per se, but they're actually drawings of motors and drives and valves and push buttons and all kinds of things. Now, Cscape with Symbols fully integrates this symbol library with Cscape. Now, we love free software here at Horner. Cscape with Symbols is something that we're not able to give away, though, because we have to compensate the company that drew all the symbols. So it can be purchased at the Horner website for $118. Now, the retail price of the Symbol Factory, which is the commercial product that we've integrated, is $500. So if you were to buy it independently from Cscape, you'd spend $500 on it. So $118, especially if you can take advantage of a lot of those graphics, that's a pretty good deal. So Symbol Factory is definitely something I'd recommend. Let's take a look at what we can do with that. Okay, so when you're using the symbol library, it's very much like you're using just a regular static bitmap object. And let me start by saying that, again, you have to have the symbol version of Cscape installed on your computer before you start. Okay? But assuming you've done that, again, you choose the static bitmap object, you select it, you click and drag the object to the approximate size that you're looking for, and then when that static bitmap dialog box pops up, you select Pick Symbol instead of bitmap or JPEG or SVG. Okay? And then after a few seconds, now the first time that you load it in a Cscape session, it could take a few seconds to come up. After that, subsequent times when it appears, it'll only take maybe a second or two. But just be aware of that. Be a little bit patient. It does take a few seconds the first time. But then again, it'll pop up full screen. And then what you'll see are categories of symbols. And when you select a category, in the main part of the screen, you will see all the different illustrations and artwork that are associated with that category. You'll be able to select a particular graphic that you're interested in, and then you have the ability to adjust its colors, both in the foreground and the fill, as well as the background. So that's really handy, right? Not only do you pick the symbol that you want, but you can also recolor it if you need to do that. Okay, all from within the symbol library window. And then when you're done and it's looking the way you want, you double click on the item and it takes you back into Cscape, and then you finish the configuration process, which is identical to what it was when you were just doing a static bitmap, picking a BMP or a JPEG file. Okay, so here's some hints on how to get good results with a symbol library. Okay, first of all, on first glance, some of the objects may appear to only have a few colors, but they have a lot of shading involved. So don't assume that you can get by with, say, 16 colors or 256 colors even if they have a lot of shading. Because if you cut down a number of colors, you also greatly cut down in the amount of shading that can be done. All right. The other thing I recommend, just like I do with images, is at least initially don't select scale to fit. Go ahead and configure it without that checked. Complete your configuration and allow it to be drawn on your screen in its native size. And then if you need to adjust the size, you can, but then you'll have seen its native aspect ratio and the shape and all those sorts of good things. So that is the first hint. Don't select scale to fit. And in general, go ahead, if it's got shading, set the number of colors up to the maximum of 32,000. Next, if you're using transparency, it's especially important to go with a high number of colors so that Cscape can differentiate between the background color and the fill color. Also, if you're using transparency and it turns out that the default transparency color, which is light blue with the symbol library, if that's close to some of the colors you need to use in the object itself, you have the ability in the dialog box to actually change the background color of the symbol and pick something that's completely different than any other color that's included in the graphic, and then Cscape will have an incredibly easy time in stripping away that background and making the object nice and transparent. So those are my hints for utilizing the symbol library. And again, it's a two-step process when it comes to the transparency. If the color that is by default transparent is not close to anything in the graphic, you're good to go. If it is, you'll want to go ahead and select your own transparent color to make it easy on Cscape. Okay. Once again, let's dive into demonstration so that we can show how that works. So let's go into Cscape. And I'm going to head on into my user interface, and let's go ahead and go back to the graphics editor. We'll maximize again. We'll go to, this time we'll go to a screen where I'm just doing simple motor control. And again, there's nothing advanced about my example here, but I want to focus on, again, bringing in graphics, bringing in symbols. So instead of just having a color in the background, what I thought I would do here is just show a picture of the motor just to bring some interest to the screen, okay? So let's go ahead and use the symbol library to find a picture of a motor that kind of looks like the main motor that I'm using on my machine, and let's bring it in and just show it here on the screen just for interest's sakes. Okay, so we'll do that to start with. We'll talk about some other functionality we can use a little bit later, but let's just start by bringing one in. Okay, so again, I'm going to select the static bitmap object. I'm going to draw the approximate size that I need. It doesn't have to be exact. Okay, I'm going to double click on it. Again, I'm going to pick my maximum amount of colors. I'm not going to scale it to fit initially. And this time I'm going to hit pick symbol. All right, now what I'm looking for is a main motor. Okay, so you notice there was a little bit of a lag there from the time I pressed the button to the time it popped up. So don't let that throw you off. This is the symbol library, and here's all the different categories. So the first category are, 3D push buttons, and there's architectural symbols. There's chemical categories, all kinds of stuff. But I happen to know also that there is a motors section here. And I'm going to say that, let's say this motor is close to what I'm looking for in terms of my main motor on my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. But let's say for the sake of argument that green isn't what I'm looking for. I just want a gray colored motor. So I want to recolor this. Well, how would I do that? Well, first, of course, I selected it. Next, I go to the lower right-hand side of the dialog. And instead of the fill being the original fill, I'm going to select a shaded fill. And under fill color, I'm going to select a different color. And let's go ahead and go with a gray here and see how that looks. All right, I like it. That's what I'm looking for. So now that motor is looking just the way I want. I'm going to go ahead and double click on it. And I brought the motor in to my dialog box. Terrific. Again, I'm not scaling it initially. I'm going to let it draw it in its original aspect ratio the first time. I will, though, go ahead and treat the background as transparent. And let's see how it does. It looks okay here. I mean, I could, to be extra safe, I could go in under the background color here, and I could make that background color something vastly different from gray. And then when I treat the background as transparent, also manually select that color of red to really make sure Cscape has an easy time in pulling that background color out. But I probably didn't have to do that in this case, but I just wanted to show you how to do it anyway. So I hit OK here, and now what I have is the motor in its original aspect ratio and its original size. So if it's not quite the size I want, I can change the size. I can make it a little bigger, a little smaller at this stage, but I know what the aspect ratio is supposed to be, so it makes it easier for me to have a true representation of it. Or I can also just move these things out a little bit and make a little more room for the motor. That's another thing I can do if I want to make room for it in its native size. Okay, so let's see how that looks. Let's go ahead and close that down. I'm going to go ahead and hit the download button here. All right, we want to see how that symbol looks. While we're doing the download, we'll head back to our overhead view here in a second. All right, our download is still working. All right, so I navigate over to my motor screen, and sure enough, that looks pretty good. Okay, I've got a good looking motor there. It's interesting, but it's not really functional other than the fact that, the operator can visualize the fact that it's a motor they're starting up. But what if we might have the ability to have that photo or that image of that motor change depending on what's happening on the machine with that motor? That might be a good feature for us to take advantage of. Well, that's where another feature comes into play, and that's called the animation object. So let's go ahead and take a look at that guy. All right, so the animation object is an object in the Cscape graphics editor that allows users to display a different graphic at any given time depending on what's happening with the value of a variable. So as a variable changes, the actual image that's displayed also changes. And this can be used to illustrate the state of a device, running or not running, on or off, for instance. It can also be used to indicate that an object is in motion. So you might have a fan or a gear or something that by alternating between a couple different images, you could be simulating motion or indicating to the operator that the thing is moving. Okay, so how does this work? How do we utilize that? Well, again, it's very similar to what we did with the static bitmap. We select the animation object by clicking on it. We click and drag an object onto the screen of the approximate size that we want. We double click on that object, and this time up pops the animated bitmap object. Okay, now there's a difference. The first thing we have to do, or one of the things we have to do that we didn't have to do with the static bitmap, is we have to assign an actual variable. This is the variable that the OCS will read to determine which graphic it's going to display. Okay, so that means you need to assign a variable to the object. And that variable could be a 1-bit variable. Let's say you have something that's running or not running, started or stopped, on or off. You could use a 1-bit variable to describe that activity. Or maybe it's a 3-position valve or something. In that scenario, you're going to need at least, let's say an 8-bit number or a 16-bit number to represent those 3 different states. You can't just use a single bit. So when you assign your variable, of course, you also need to assign how many bits that variable is. So that's the first step. Next, you have to basically select a frame number. Now, what is a frame number? Now, if you have an object that has 2 states, on or off, for instance, there's literally 2 frames or 2 graphics that will be associated with that object. When the device is off, 1 frame will be displayed. When the device is on, a different frame will be displayed. If you have a 3-state valve, similar, but now you have more frames. You'll have a frame 0, a frame 1, and a frame 2. And you can have, using the animated object, you can have up to 50 frames associated with the same variable. Of course, that means it can't be a bit type variable since you have 50 different potential values tied to that particular object. Okay, so you need to select a frame number, and almost always the first frame you select is going to be frame 0. What's the value at 0? So once you've selected the frame value of 0, let's say, next you're going to pick the image that's affiliated with that particular frame. And it also could be a symbol. It doesn't have to be a separate file. Okay, so you're going to pick either the image or the file, or the symbol, I should say, for that particular frame. And then once you've done that and selected that particular image, you're going to follow the same rules we've talked about in terms of color depth and transparency and all those things to make sure that the object is going to, that particular frame is going to look the way you want it to look when the variable is of that value. Okay, and then once you've finished programming and configuring frame number 0, then it's a matter of configuring the other frames, whether it's just frame 0 and frame 1, or there's a frame 2, or maybe there could be as many as 50 images affiliated with that particular object. So that's really the process that's involved in configuring the animated bitmap. So once again, there is one more feature to be aware of, and that is this. There's also a touch selection available with the animated object, and that means that if that touch option is selected and the operator presses that object, that graphic on the screen, then the action of the operator of pressing the object will cause the frame to change. So it'll go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc. If there's only 2 frames, it's just going to alternate between 0 and 1. If there's 3 frames, it'll alternate between 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. So you can kind of turn that object into an input object by clicking on that touch selection there. Okay, now let's take a look in Cscape how we're going to make this guy work. All right, so back we go to Cscape. And what I have here from a logic standpoint, if we take a quick look at that here, the first thing we're going to do for my motor is let's just make the motor change its appearance when the motor's actually running. So let's use animation for that. All right, so this is just a simple start-stop circuit that controls my motor running. Okay, so let's go to our user interface through our graphics editor. Let's navigate to the motor control screen. And then instead of using just a static bitmap for this guy, let's draw a new object on the screen that is an animated object. Okay, and it's the same process. Approximate size here, double click, but I have to assign a variable. Now, what variable am I going to assign here? Well, I want the image to change when the motor is running. So the variable that I want to select here, and it's going to be a 1-bit variable, the variable I want to select here is the motor run variable. Okay, so the OCS is going to monitor motor run, and when motor run is a 0, it's going to display an image. And what image is it going to display? Well, it's the one I select. So let's go ahead and select a symbol frame. Okay, and then back to my symbol library, and convenient enough, this motor is still displayed, but when the motor is off, I don't want it to be green. I want it to be gray. So let's go here and change our shading from green to gray. All right, and let's double click here. All right, let's not scale to fit. Let's treat it as transparent. Okay, and this is frame number 0. So that's just the way we want frame number 0. Frame number 1 is going to be displayed when motor run is a 1. So let's go ahead and pick the symbol frame for that guy. It happens to be exactly this. Colored green is what I want to show in this demo. There would be other ways of doing it, but that's a simple way. So this is exactly what we want without making any changes. Let's go ahead and select that. Get rid of the transparency, make sure everything else looks good, and say, what didn't look good was our number of colors. We don't want 16 colors. Why not? Well, even though that's a relatively simple graphic, there's quite a bit of shading, and we're pulling the background layer out. So we want to always make sure that we use a lot of colors for that. So I turn that to 32,000 colors for frame number 1. I'm going to do the same thing for frame number 0. Well, it was already set, so we're good to go there. Okay, and I can hit OK. And that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy. And I'll center him up just a little. And let's go ahead and download him. All right. So let's go ahead and download this program. While that's downloading, I'll get the OCS ready here. We'll switch to our overhead view while we finish up the download. And let's see how that one works out. Okay, again, navigate to our motor control screen. Now when we hit start, look, the motor changes color. There we go. So we've used an animated bitmap instead of just a straight bitmap on the screen. It's got a little more functionality than just showing a picture of something. But both are functional. Okay, now let's also show motion in this application a little bit, or try and demonstrate to an operator that something is moving. So in addition to this motor control here, I also have a gear drive control, and I've got a similar start-stop button arrangement here. And I've got, in this case though, I also have a slow and fast speed on the drive gear. So let's go ahead and add a graphic here, but let's add something that will kind of indicate motion, that the gears are turning, that the drive is moving, as opposed to just showing on and off. Okay, so let's go back into Cscape, and we're going to go back and continue to use our animated bitmap object. Let's go ahead and take a look now at this simple logic I have here. Now I have the same logic for starting and stopping the drive gear as I do for the motor, but what I also have is I have a little bit of extra logic for animating a graphic that I'm going to put on the screen. So what you often find is you'll find in symbol libraries like ours, the one that we use, you'll find pairs of graphics that when you alternate between those two images, it simulates motion, like a fan turning or a gear turning, whatever the case may be. But in order for that motion to be simulated, you have to change the value of the variable that is being used to animate or alternate those particular images. So in this case, what I've done is whenever the motor is actually running, if the speed is set to fast, I'm going to make this bit turn on and off relatively quickly, every 100 milliseconds, whereas if the speed is set to slow while the motor's running, or the drive motor's running, then I'm going to alternate those gears much slower. So that's what I'm doing in the background logic-wise. But let's go to the screen editor, and let's set this up. It won't take us long. Okay, let's navigate to our gear motor screen. Let's again select our animated bitmap object. Okay, again, we're just drawing an approximate size. We have to assign a variable, and in this case, the variable we want to assign is our drive animation bit. So that's a bit that its only purpose is to turn on and off to allow us to animate the turning of the gears. Okay, let's select 32,000 colors. Let's not scale to fit. Let's go ahead and hit the symbol frame here for frame 0. And I happen to know that the gears that I'm looking for are in the machining category of the symbol library. And they're right here, these two gears right there. So I'll select the first one. I'm okay with gray as a color. I'll double click that. Okay. Let's treat the background as transparent. The colors looks good. Let's go to frame 1. Let's pick another symbol frame. Back to the symbol library. We'll pick the second image this time, which is slightly rotated from the first. That's the difference. Otherwise, it looks the same. Again, we'll make sure our background is treated as transparent. Our colors is good. One thing I did forget, you not only have to configure your variable, but in this dialog, you also have to configure the variable size of 1 bit. I'm sure that's something we'll address with Cscape at some point, because it ought to be able to figure that out on its own. Okay, so let's hit OK. All right, so we've drawn a gear here that will turn whenever this variable alternates between 0 and 1. Now, a single gear isn't all that interesting. Let's go ahead and make a second gear by just copying and pasting this particular object and making sure the gears themselves are interlocked. Okay, and let's give this a try. Let's see if this works. All right, we'll go ahead and do our download. And then we'll transition over to our EXL6 view here while our download is occurring. Okay, we'll navigate past the motor screen to our gear drive control. Let's see what happens. We're set for slow currently. Let's see what happens when we hit start. There we go. Those are turning very slowly to kind of indicate we have motion. If I switch the speed to fast, you can see there's a big difference in in speed there. So this is just a simple little way that you can actually kind of illustrate to your operators that you've got motion going on. So it's one of the things you can use the animated object for. Now, one thing I do want to mention before we kind of wrap things up here and I bring Casey back in, one thing I do want to mention is, I think I did say this earlier in the presentation, but we do have a variety of other new capabilities that will be released with Cscape 10, some of which will depend on new models of OCSs to be released, others that won't depend on that, that will add to the number of things that you can do from an image and animation standpoint. Specifically, for instance, PNG files that have built-in transparency will be supported, for example, as well as GIF files as well. So we're going to continue to add the functionality of the product as we go. But let me go ahead and bring Casey back in. All right, Casey. So hopefully that was a pretty good demonstration of, how to get images that you bring in to look the way you want them, with some tips and tricks there, and then some things that you can do to kind of animate things a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a pretty good presentation. And we had a couple comments and questions here and there that we can bring up. I think a couple of them are pretty handy to bring about. I answered a couple of them in the chat as well, so it should be in both places. But one was from Mark. The original purchased symbol library still be used as you upgrade the Cscape software? And the answer is absolutely. We can put you in contact with our tech support department if you had any issues regarding that transfer, but absolutely, if you purchase it, you can move it to newer versions as well. Absolutely,
and there's actually, it's not handled automatically. So let's say that you've got Cscape, 9.8 with the symbol library, well, let's say 9.9 with the symbol library, and you've got that installed, and you want to go ahead and get the latest version, which is Service Pack 4 or Service Pack 5. Well, if you go to the website and download the free version of Cscape and install it, you'll say, oh, what happened to my symbol library? It's gone. So a couple things there. One is, if you copy away the symbols folder in your original Cscape directory or Cscape with symbols directory, if you copy that away and then do the install on the latest free version, you can move that folder back in and everything will work just beautifully. Okay, so you can do that. Also, if you accidentally didn't do that step and your symbol library is gone and you paid for it, tech support will get you another copy of the install to go ahead and install it the full way as well. So absolutely.
Absolutely. And then another question that came up was, if you have too many images, could that slow down your program execution?
I don't think so, no. I mean, the only issue you would have in general would be you might run out of space at some point. So what we do in the OCS that maybe some companies don't do is we allocate a certain amount of space for graphics, like bitmaps, a certain amount of space for fonts, a certain amount of space for other objects, that sort of thing. So we try and do that to try and help with the performance of the unit so it doesn't suffer too much by becoming overloaded. So I don't think you would notice much of a difference at all from having a lot of graphics. Now, if you've got one screen that's just packed with bitmaps, you could potentially notice some impact there when that screen is switched to. But I still think, because of the performance level of the OCS in graphics, that you aren't going to see much of a difference there even.
I even actually expanded upon that even farther. If there is a particular, because again, for like the Excel series, you can have 1,000 objects or so on a particular screen. But if you do have a particular graphics heavy screen, there's even options within the system menu of the controller to dedicate more resources to graphics responsiveness or scan time responsiveness.
Right.
So there's even the adjustability there. So that's kind of nice in a lot of different ways. You can either enhance your responsiveness or dedicate, again, just scan time specifics. So,
absolutely, yeah.
A lot of different options there.
Yeah, that tuning parameter is pretty darn useful for really graphics heavy applications. If you do find that maybe your OCS is struggling a little bit in terms of at least not performing with the snappiness on the screen that you'd like, then you can tune that. We haven't had to use it very much. It actually comes up probably more often. Does it come up with video? I know we're not talking about video today, but do you have to adjust it at all because of video, or is that kind of unrelated?
I think it's kind of unrelated
Okay.
for the most part. Now, with Cscape 10 and different aspect ratios or a different size of video files, that may change. But as of right now, I don't think it changes all that much.
Okay, very good. All right, thanks. Any other questions that you can think of?
I don't think so. I'm not seeing any other ones pop in, so I think we're good.
Okay, very good. Well, let's go ahead and remind everyone a couple things. First of all, we have a few seats left, only a few though, for our first Horner Automation virtual training, which is October 12th and 13th. You can obviously perform this training remotely, and we do guarantee you will get hands-on labs with hands-on equipment delivered to you, and you'll have to provide your own OCS or purchase your own OCS at a discount, but the lab equipment that you use that is part of the tuition is included and you get to keep it. So that's a real bonus for our virtual training. And I think as of this morning, we had 4 slots left in virtual training. So don't hesitate too long on that. Also, just our normal reminder, every Tuesday we're here with another technical topic, whether it's related to communications or logic, or today, graphics, for instance. We'll try and bring you something new every week that you can either watch live or that you can actually watch on replay when you actually have a chance to work on that particular function. And then for August, we've got a full slate ahead with today, of course, was graphics and animation. Integrating audio, that should be a fun one next week, kind of groovy, as they say. And then hands-on with BACnet. BACnet is a building an automation control protocol over Ethernet and over a serial, which is very hot these days. And our BACnet introduction is one of our highest totaled videos in terms of views. So we're going to build on that by doing hands-on with BACnet in the middle of the month. So that'll be good. We're not only going to just quickly recap what BACnet's all about, but we're also going to give you some hands-on experience with using the OCS BACnet driver. And then we've got a 2-part series to finish out the month, both dealing with kind of advanced topics on removable media, which is micro SD, USB drives, those sorts of things. We think that'll be really worthwhile for folks as well. So don't forget, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. And click the bell so that you'll get notifications when we have videos. And it's not just YouTube video, or it's not just, I should say, live stream videos. We have other videos that we're releasing all the time. And there's going to be even more and more as we have a bunch of new products that are approaching release over the upcoming months of 2021. Okay, so once again, I thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you, or virtually at least, next Tuesday for our next topic. Take care.